My name is Amichai Magen. I'm a member of faculty here at the Lauder School of Government. I'm a senior researcher at the ICT, the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, and lead our governance and political violence program, which we've set up 3 years ago. And when we set it up and I explained that I want to look at the relationship between state stability, weakness, failure, and terrorism, civil wars, insurgencies. People didn't quite understand what the significance of that was, and as the Arab Spring turned into autumn and winter, and as events have unfolded in Iraq, Syria, but also Libya, Yemen, Sinai, the whole region really. The nexus between governance, issues of statehood, sovereignty, and political violence has become clearer. I also want to mention that I'm a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and really the topic of today's workshop emerged from a visit that Boaz Ganor and I, together with Eitan Azani, did to the west coast of the United States several months ago. And just that you understand the context, we visited some friends and colleagues at Stanford. We had lunch with Martha Cranshaw and also with Joe Felter, Colonel Joe Felter, Army Ranger, and the man who established the counterterrorism program at West Point after 9/11. He's now at Stanford, and we had lunch, and I said to Martha and Joe, so what's the debate in Washington? Where do we go from here? If state building and counterinsurgency have proven to be so costly, so difficult in both blood and treasure, and if the returns have been so few in terms of democratization, even political stability, where do we go from here? And they sort of looked at one another, and there was this kind of quiet, and people looked down at their salad a little bit. And it was clear that nobody really had a very good answer to that. And so we started having a conversation about where does American policy, where does Western policy go after these grand, expensive, massive exercises in counterinsurgency and state building. And this is really the background to today's workshop. We thought that this is, I think all of us here believe that this is a critical issue. It seems like the Obama administration is grappling exactly with these issues over the last few days. And Secretary Kerry was in Saudi Arabia yesterday trying to begin to put together this coalition to destroy and degrade and destroy ISIS. The whole debate about will there be boots on the ground, will there not be boots on the ground? So this is proven to be very, very timely and very pertinent. But before we jump into the substance, I want to remind all of us that we are on a day of remembrance. In fact, I would venture to say that we are remembering three related but different things this morning. In the Torah, we are commanded, there are many commandments in the Torah, but the one mitzvah that is mentioned most times in the Torah is actually shamor v'zechor. To preserve and remember is the mitzvah, the religious commandment that is mentioned most times in the Torah, and we take it seriously. Clearly, we are meeting the morning of the 13th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. 13 years have passed, and still everybody remembers where they were on that day. Not only did 2,977 people lose their lives, but our entire way of looking at the world, of looking at security, has really changed on that day, and that change is still very much with us. It reverberates with us, and it will undoubtedly come into the discussions that we will have in the workshop this morning. Each one of those 2,977 people who lost their lives on 9/11 was a unique individual with a family, with a future, with dreams, etc. I hope I'm not getting too religious on you, but again, in Jewish tradition, in Jewish thought, we say that every human being, every individual is an entire universe. The Talmud tells us that if we save the life of one human being, it's as if we've saved an entire world. And on this morning, we remember one very special man in particular. And this workshop is dedicated in loving memory of Major Eyal Ragunis, Zichro Livracha. And we are honored to have the Ragunis family here with us this morning. Raya, Chaim, On, Venoa, Noah, po itanu. Thank you so much for being with us. The Ragunis family has really become part of our family, part of the ICT family. We are honored to dedicate this workshop in memory of Major Eyal Ragunis. Let me just say a couple of words about Eyal. Eyal was a legendary intelligence officer in Sayeret Matkal, Israel's elite reconnaissance special forces unit. He had a unique mind. He was a great humanist and a passionate architect. And he managed to combine his passion for design, for architecture, for the creativity and meticulousness of architecture with his military intelligence work, and really excelled in this regard. It's incredible. Every year we hold a ceremony in which the Ragunis Memorial funds research projects of IDC and IDF officers, and the level of love and participation and involvement, not just from the IDC but from the academic community and the military community, is I would say even increases year after year. We are usually honored by the personal participation of Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, now Israel's Minister of Defense, who was Eyal's commander in Sayeret Matkal, and he is very close to our heart. He tragically passed away in 1995, aged 37. We're also coming up to what we call Hayamim HaNoraim, the days of awe in the Jewish calendar. I don't know what happened to me. We're talking about religion this morning.
You can get a job in Bar-Ilan.
Thank you. But no, it's fitting. It's fitting. We're coming up to the days of awe, to Rosh Hashanah, and we're coming up to Yom Kippur. And in a moment, you'll see why this is relevant, not just to position us in the moment of the year that we're in, but the Yom Kippur War and the trauma of the Yom Kippur War is something that is seared into the minds and hearts of all Israelis. And it has various layers of significance, but I think one of the most important layers of significance is that we got the conceptia, as we say. We got it wrong. We got the doctrine wrong. In 1973, we prepared for a reality that didn't exist anymore. Perhaps we missed opportunities that we shouldn't have missed for new alliances, new possibilities to prevent the conflict, and we paid a very, very, very high price for getting the conceptia wrong. And I think that this is something that is and should be a daily reminder to Israelis, but I would venture to say that this is a lesson to the Western world more broadly, that we must also think, as Eyal Ragunis thought, outside of the box, creatively, being very critical, being deeply skeptical about our own thinking, and constantly questions ourselves, do we have the conceptia right? Do we have the doctrine right? And I think this is very pertinent to the issues that we are speaking about today, because the paradigm of counterinsurgency, the paradigm of state building has really been the conceptia. It's really been, as we say in Hebrew, it's really been the doctrine that has framed our thinking about asymmetrical conflict, which is the main type of conflict that exists in the world today over the last decade. And we need to be very honest and critical about what we got right and what we got wrong, and where we go from here, so that we are better prepared to deal with the conflicts of the future and not err into expensive mistakes by being prepared for yesterday's conflicts. Let me just say, just very briefly, I'm going from the sacred to the profane here. Talk a little bit about the timeline and structure of this workshop. We have 2.5 hours, right? 2 hours. We have 2 hours today. No, we have no. How many? We have 2.5, right? We start. We have 2.5 hours, right? Because we finished at 11. So we have 2.5 hours. That's half an hour less than originally scheduled, and that's because of the Prime Minister's visit this afternoon. What we will do in a moment, I'll introduce our very distinguished panelists. Each of them will make a short framing statement, and then we will open it up. We want this to be interactive. We want this to be an exchange and a very much a discussion. Let me, before introducing the panelists, and what I'll do is I'll introduce them each individually and then hand the floor to them. Let me just make some very brief framing remarks. As I mentioned, over the past decade, counterinsurgency, or COIN as we refer to it, and efforts at state building became the dominant paradigm in American and indeed British thinking about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This was going to be the new kind of war. This is going to be the doctrine that would replace Cold War thinking and in some respects provide the theoretical and policy architecture of the global war on terror, the GWAT, the global war on terror. This was going to be the theoretical and policy underpinnings of how the global war and terror is going to be fought. COIN and the new security-driven state-building agenda, what Condoleezza Rice called the win, hold, and build strategy, right? You win the military battle, you hold the territory, and then you build institutions and governance that you can then transfer to the local authorities. We have to remember this marked a really sharp departure from the early Bush administration instinct for caution and realism and modesty in foreign policy. I'm going to paraphrase Condoleezza Rice once again. She famously said in the year 2000 that we don't need to have the 82nd Airborne Division escorting kids to kindergarten. I believe she was speaking about Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the Bush team came into power very skeptical about state-building, nation-building efforts, and advocating, if I remember correctly, a much more light-footed, realistic, as they saw it, strategy. But all of that, of course, changed on 9/11, and things evolved very rapidly. And we need to, I think, remember that this strategy was forged under pressure in the crucible of things going wrong in Afghanistan, but in particular in Iraq. And if we want to locate the latest incarnations of the principles of counterinsurgency doctrine, we need to remember that they were forged under these conditions of pressure, really by a handful of warrior PhDs, including General Petraeus, and advisors like David Kilcullen and others, in 2005 and 2006. Eitan Shamir, Dr. Shamir, will say something about the key principles of COIN, so I'm not going to belabor the issue. Let me just mention that the key tenets of this paradigm, and they're articulated in the Army Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual, FM 324 from 2007. The key tenets included the notions that victory was defined in terms of leaving behind a legitimate, self-sustaining government. That this war against terrorists and insurgents is essentially what the manual called population-centric warfare, based on defeating the insurgency through providing legitimate governance, rather than enemy-centric warfare, which is really about killing the mosquitoes rather than drying the swamps. So this was a key tenet. And there are other principles, but I think this is the gist of it. That you don't win this war by killing the bad guys. You win this war by steering populations towards legitimate government, away from the insurgents, and that the way to victory is the establishment of political order. It's the establishment of legitimate government. Democratic, if we can, but at the very least stable and functioning if we cannot. Now, the continuing bloodshed in Afghanistan and Iraq prompted critics to take aim at the core assumptions and logic of coin and state building already in the period 2007-2010. A combination of new Western austerity, the financial crisis, a growing sense of tiredness in the United States, a growing sense of a desire for isolationism in the United States, coupled with the proliferation of failed states, the proliferation of areas of limited statehood, which became very accelerated since the onset of the Arab Spring in 2010, really left an impression that this was a fool's errand, that we don't know how to do it, we don't have the tools to do it, and that perhaps we shouldn't be engaged in any of this type of providing government in a box to far-fledged parts of the world that are just not ready for modern sovereignty, statehood, and democracy. And of course, this doesn't address what you do, but there was a growing sense of disillusionment and tiredness with the idea that stability and good governance could be exported, especially to places like Iraq and Syria and Libya. Now, against this background, our workshop seeks to analyze the rise and fall of the coin state-building paradigm. We should be very careful not to throw away the baby with the bathwater. Let's be very respectful of the lives of so many brave men and women who were lost in the acquisition, in this effort to bring stability and to fight insurgency in Iraq and Syria. I think we need to respect that, and we need to avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past where valuable lessons have been thrown away. So we should be very mindful about what should be preserved from the coin and state building experiences of Afghanistan, Iraq. But we should also ask hard questions about, given the constraints, financial constraints, perhaps the shift in power in the international system away from the West and towards other rising authorities, given the proliferation of areas of limited statehood, the rise of these, multiple non-state armed groups that are now running around North Africa and the Middle East, vast areas. Is this the right paradigm still? Is this the right strategy, or do we need something different? And if we need something different, if we don't do this, then what do we do? Do we go back to conventional counter-terrorism? Do we rely on drone technology and new types of technology to go after these guys from the air, leaving the political conditions on the ground as they are? Can we think of some kind of hybrid model that combines traditional counterterrorism with the lessons of counterinsurgency and state building? Could we begin to see sort of more modest training, capacity building programs, other types of lighter-footed, cheaper strategies? And are those strategies likely to give us at least the minimal amount of international security that we need and that we demand, given the nature of the threat, the nature of the groups that we are dealing with, the fluidity of the situation, the danger of destabilization of remaining islands of stability. We in Israel are extremely concerned about the situation in Jordan in particular, for example. So all of these questions are before us this morning. And I'm truly grateful, honored, and delighted to have the group of panelists that we have with us this morning. This is a labor of love for all of them, and I think with the exception of Eitan and now John, who's a member of the ICT family, everybody around this table has traveled long distances to be with us this morning, and I'm very happy that you've agreed to be with us and share your expertise with us. And as you'll see, we were careful about whom we invited, and we wanted to have people with deep knowledge, but also diverse knowledge. And I think that will become apparent as we progress. Okay, I've spoken long enough. Let me introduce our first panelist for this morning, Dr. Eitan Shamir. Eitan is a senior faculty member at the Political Science Department at Bar Ilan and a senior research fellow with the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, the BESA Center. Prior to his academic position, he was in charge of the National Security Doctrine Department at the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in the Prime Minister's office in Israel. And before joining the ministry, he was a senior fellow at the Dado Center for Interdisciplinary Military Studies at the IDF General Headquarters. Eitan Shamir teaches in the IDF Staff and Command College, the IDF Operational Art Course, and the IDF Junior Officers Academic Programs. So he's also very much engaged in what's happening within the IDF on the ground. He holds a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College, London, and his research interest and publications focus on topics such as command, military reform, and military and strategic culture. Let me just mention that he is the author most recently of the book Transforming Command, The Pursuit of Mission Command in the US, UK, and Israeli Armies, with my alma mater, Stanford University Press. Eitan, we all at the ICT know him very well. We always are impressed by his not just knowledge of counterinsurgency history, doctrine, and theory, but his fresh thinking and creativity. I think Eitan will speak a little bit about the principles of COIN so that we all have a conceptual background to, a sound conceptual background to the discussion today, but perhaps would also say something about how Israel has approached this, and you will see immediately that the Israeli attitude towards these issues is very different from that of the United States. Without further ado, Eitan, the floor is yours, and then we'll introduce the remainder of the panelists.
Thank you very much, Amichai.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for hosting me in this really, I think, very interesting panel and very challenging. So, as Amichai noted, I was asked to talk about the Israeli perspective, but I will start a little bit with although Amichai, you gave, I think, a fairly clear introduction to what COIN is. I would say that I would start by saying that in essence, COIN is not a strategy. COIN is the short for anyone who's not in the field, is the short term for counter-insurgency. Okay, so we refer to COIN. COIN is not a strategy. COIN is a situation. There is an insurgency, and one is trying to counter it. How one may attempt to do this, that is the strategy. So we usually speak about people-centric or enemy-centric as different strategies for how to conduct COIN. So when speaking about COIN here, the idea is people-centric. So usually when you read papers that, or you hear people debating about what they refer as COIN or counterinsurgency, they actually mean people counterinsurgency or counterinsurgency people-centric. Now we can talk about 4 major strategies to overcome COIN. Usually they are only categorized in this sense. In reality, they're always mixed. So we refer to 4 categories. One is containment, which I would refer to winning hearts and minds as part of containment. The second is exhaustion, exhausting your rival. The third is attrition, and the fourth is annihilation. Now, Israel, in terms of counterinsurgency, Israel finds itself in an interesting position and in intersection of opposing interpretations to the US in regard to COIN doctrine. As manifested, the COIN doctrine is manifested in the manual Amichai was referring to, the Petraeus COIN manual. The more universal question and debate in this regard is whether Israel's way of countering non-state groups should be regarded as a canary in the mine, or alternatively as an anachronistic approach that does not fit into current challenges. I would argue it's the former. Since 2001, Israel and the US have found themselves fighting similar enemies, and therefore the tactics involved were often also similar. However, the basic approach, the strategic premise, and logic were very different between the two countries and their respective militaries. The strategy of the US and its allies was articulated and summarized in the Clearhold build that you just mentioned, doctrine. It reflected the idea that there are several logical steps to conduct this type of campaign, a known departure point and a clear end state. The end state was a functioning government with an established and legitimate government that exercised effective governance, rule of law and monopoly over the use of force. This new administration will be modeled and molded as close as possible to the model of a Western liberal democracy. State building requires legitimacy, according to Coin theory. Legitimacy is essential in defeating the insurgency. Separate the fish from the sea, as the famous Mao Zedong quote goes. When things didn't go well in Iraq, a group of soldiers and intellectuals, again, Amichai, you mentioned some of them, Kilkern and John Nagel, together with Patreas, offered the new 2006 Coin manual, inspired by the classic writings such as Lawrence of Arabia, Mao Zedong, etc., but also based on colonial thinkers such as British Clawell's Small Wars and post-colonial French David Galula. Counter-Insurgency Warfare Theory in Practice, this is his famous book. The manual recommends avoiding overemphasized, and this is a quote, overemphasizing killing and capturing the enemy rather than securing and engaging the populace, and also advises not to conduct large-scale operations, and again, quote, conduct large-scale operations and use of special operations forces for the purpose of raiding. Instead, it encourages, quote, focusing on the population, its needs, and its security while establishing and securing key areas. Other principles in the manual include emphasize intelligence and secure borders. The doctrine also calls for an increased amount of troops to maintain presence and visibility, so it provides a sense of security and engage in various tasks that are non-combat in their nature, such as helping to build infrastructure and delivering basic services to the people. It is not surprising, therefore, that the US senior officer who gave a lecture to senior IDF officers on his Iraq tour lessons chose, to the surprise of his audience, to share his achievements in promoting women's rights rather than explaining better ways to kill insurgents. Why was the audience, consisting of seasoned IDF officers, surprised? During the years, the US and British security establishment almost obsessively studied the theory of population-centered coin, in which the IDF showed very little interest. During these exact same years, the IDF was busy fighting the Second Intifada from 2000 to about 2005, the Second Lebanon War, 2006, Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, 2008. Indeed, some tactical aspects were shared and cross-learned, given the similar enemy. For example, gathering intelligence, stopping suicide bombers, fighting in densely populated areas, countering IDs, etc. However, framing the campaign around ideas such as hearts and minds and state building were remote and foreign to the IDF. Israel's situation is very different for political reasons. Coin assumes there is an internal conflict between the reigning government and a group of insurgents who wish to overthrow it. Except a few relatively short periods, Israel has not faced this problem. Israel has not been fighting an internal enemy, someone that Israel is ruling, but rather an external enemy. Fighting an external enemy without conquering its land and population is not, by definition, counterinsurgency, and therefore requires a different political logic and a different strategic approach. Prior to '67, and since the establishment of Israel, the way the IDF countered terrorists who infiltrated Israel's borders were through a system of retaliatory attacks or punitive raids. These were aimed to assure the other side that it could pay a high price for its actions. The '56 Sinai campaign could be seen in this context, a large punitive raid. A condition for a successful punitive raid is high-quality intelligence. Without good intelligence, the chances of hitting high-value targets when confronting an elusive enemy is small. Absent of good intelligence, the operation might become a pounding-the-dust operation. In this operation, technological advances and expensive weapons are launched and create an impressive effect in the media, but make no serious damage to the opponent. I'm talking about the pounding-dust operations. To the Israeli traditional approach, I would mention two exceptions. Two exceptions, but important exceptions. For lack of time, I will go only to one example. Maybe later, if we have more time, I will elaborate on the second example. The first case is the policies designed by Moshe Dayan as a defense minister in the West Bank in Gaza immediately after the end of the 6 Days War. Dayan's policy were turned under the title liberal occupation or open bridges policy. The second case is the Israeli presence in South Lebanon and what was termed as the good fence policy starting in 1976. Both cases saw positive beginnings that led to high hopes, but later turned to be a bitter disappointment, each case for its own historical reasons. So I'll elaborate only on the first case. In 1967, Dayan, who had recently returned from a visit in Vietnam, which he visited in 1966, was determined to avoid a national uprising in the new territories. He opted to provide the Palestinian residents under Israeli control a strong sense of security, freedom of movement, hence open bridges, local autonomy and economic and human development. For example, under Dayan's term, 7 universities were opened in the West Bank, and all the villages were connected to electricity and water. In the 20 years until the first Intifada, standards of living had improved in the West Bank by almost any measure: economic, health, education, and even political freedom. Now, I should mention, and I didn't write down, there was also a big stick. So anyone who collaborated with terrorism was treated very harshly. So there was a carrot and stick, you can call it a carrot and stick system. However, despite the above, the first Intifada broke out and led to an Israeli soberness. Israel realized it cannot control an unwilling population, that the national religious aspirations are stronger than any economic incentives. Israel's leaders sought a way out through the Oslo Accord. Now I will skip the other example, which is the South Lebanon example. I should say that these bitter experiences in both cases with regard to governing foreign populations led Israel to seek ways to avoid such situations and to minimize its friction with hostile populations. Thus, the withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000, disengagement from Gaza in 2005, and the handing over to the Palestinian Authority the responsibility to govern most of the West Bank's population in areas A and B, which I think are responsible for 90% of the Palestinian population over there. Following the second Intifada, Israel reluctantly recaptured the entire West Bank, but handed the A and B areas back to the PA once it was assured that the PA could and would prevent terror from its territory. Following these withdrawals and coupled with the political events in the region, Israel finds itself surrounded by ungoverned areas that are used by various extremist terror and hostile organizations, some equipped better than many state militaries. In fact, the only border that does not contemporarily fit this description is the border Israel has with Jordan. Facing this geostrategic situation, Israel's options are between bad to worse. The temptation to execute a full invasion to seek complete defeat by conquering the entire territory exists. But aware of the cost and the potential damage, Israel's leadership has shown a reluctance to engage in full-scale operation designed to conquer the respected territory and seek decisive victory. Consequently, 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014, so limited operations with limited objectives, mostly focused on air and stand-off fire. These operations fall under the category of punitive raids. These IDF raids have had two purposes. One is to impair capabilities. Two, to deter both the challenger and others around him by extracting a high price from the challenger. This basic strategy, with some variations, has seen little change over the years. In an existential ethnic religious conflict, such as in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict, there seemed to be no relevance for the idea of hearts and minds and state building, at least in the Western sense of it. The Arabs would never approve of Israel's existence. At most, they would become accustomed to it and stop trying to annihilate it. This type of operations is attractive in terms of domestic politics. Punitive raids carry limited risks, therefore reducing the potential for opposition at home. Moreover, they are relatively inexpensive. There is no need to commit large forces, resort to reserves, or large-scale recruitment. They involve limited deployment of forces, including ground units, for a limited period of time. As such, punitive expeditions are also light on logistics due to the relatively short time span of operation. The downside is that frequently the results are not decisive. The central strategic idea is, when provoked, to restore deterrence through punishment and denial. Between these large preemptive raids, Israel tries to prevent armament through covert operations, accumulating intelligence, and occasionally eliminates key terrorist figures. Hence, Israel is constantly mowing the grass. However, as pressures are mounting and as the grass grows faster and bigger, this strategy may not suffice, and circumstances could lead, as it almost did recently in Gaza, to a different modus operandi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eitan. Now, I'd like to call upon Lieutenant Colonel John Kenkel, who now serves as the U.S. Army War College Fellow here at the ICT. We're delighted to have him with us as the U.S. Army College Fellow with us this year. John has rich, varied experience as a United States soldier. Let me just highlight a few of his assignments and his positions. He's been with the United States Army since 1982. He became a foreign area officer specializing in the Middle East and North Africa in 2003. He has served multiple tours in parachute units, as a rifleman, a reconnaissance scout, a battalion assistant intelligence officer, an intelligence platoon leader, and a company executive officer. And he served in multiple special force units as a military intelligence officer, including in Italy, El Salvador, Korea, and the Philippines. But it's really as a foreign area officer that he has really tremendous experience. He's worked in the American embassies in Jordan and Lebanon, in most recently in Tunisia. He was deployed in Kuwait and Iraq. He also formed and led the 180-person analytic team supporting US and NATO operations in Libya. So really tremendous operational experience at various levels of the United States Army, and we're delighted to have John with us this year. We're delighted especially to have him with us this morning to offer a soldier's perspective on some of these issues. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I want to give my condolences and thank the Ragunis family. As a fellow Special Forces military intelligence officer, I especially want to thank you that you're using your efforts to fund seminars such as this to help further understanding so that our brothers and sisters don't have to continue to mow the grass or go in harm's way. We know we always will, but thank you for trying to help us minimize that. Thank you very much. We have some slides? Yeah, okay. Don't be overwhelmed. I know I come from the Department of Defense, and it can be scary when we start pulling up PowerPoint. I have tried to minimize this, only used black and white and only used outline. Yeah, sorry, there are only under 453 slides here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, I have a little bit of the soldier side of this, but I also have been in some of the operational and theater strategic planning operations. I'm going to really just pose a couple of questions. I will not provide full answers. You can use your assessment whether this is a brilliant Socratic method or a lazy sophomoric method. Probably the second is more applicable. My perspectives come from the part of a third-party country, namely the U.S., entering into coin operations, and as Amichai said, is going to predominantly be from personal experience. I have not amassed an academic resume yet, but I do have to say that these are my views. They do not represent the U.S. government, the U.S. Army. Fortunately, I do consider myself the luckiest lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army for being able to come here for a year to study, but for academic freedom, I am able to express my personal views, and I just want to make sure that that's what we see here. So as Amichai said, I served in special forces units as an intel officer and foreign area officer. I want to emphasize one of the differences that make U.S. Army Special Forces, and I say that specifically, U.S. Army Special Forces, different from almost any other special operations force in the U.S. inventory and around the world. We were formed originally to be the insurgents, to lead unconventional warfare, guerrilla operations behind the Soviet lines if they were to attack into Western Europe. Yada, 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 move forward. The specialized training over time led us to be not only the unconventional warfare, the insurgent experts, but then the counter-insurgent experts, and then a number of collateral tasks that come out from being able to operate independently behind enemy lines. So one of the things in our special forces course, and I was an actual operator quite a while ago, we are also the only people that talk about what do you do at the end of an insurgency. We're really the only people in the U.S. government that give that specialized training. So in our the graduation exercise, we fight a guerrilla operation, and at the end, we say, thank you guys, give us the guns, go back to your farms, and be happy democratic citizens in the country of Pineland, North Carolina. That unfortunately, though, having said that, that's really about the extent to it, of it. Having also been a veteran of multiple tours in the 82nd, soldiers don't, we will do it. We will escort kids to school if necessary. We will do that democratic transition stuff if ordered to, no problems, but young sergeants in airborne and special operations units like the more kinetic kind of things. My personal views, not the views of the U.S. government. Unfortunately, I would say, unfortunately, in the last 12, 13 years, our U.S. Army Special Forces have gotten quite proficient at being the kind of counter-terrorist, door-kicking, commando, traditional kinetic operations. Unfortunately, the nature of warfare in the CENTCOM area of operations has come to make that necessary. So what I'm going to do is talk about 3 specific cases, and again, hopefully raise more questions. And you'll see the 3 cases on the screen behind me. And it kind of goes from my experience from the tactical to the operational to the theater strategic. And then kind of the discussion questions at the bottom that I think are important from my perspective. And although the title of this is what comes after COIN, I think what's more important of how we think about what comes after COIN is what were the end states that were planned before we got into COIN. If it's the war continuation, blah, 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 Clausewitzian dictum and everything, but at the end of the day, we're doing a COIN for some kind of political end. So I think that is the most important thing here. And Eitan, I can't agree with you more that COIN is not a strategy. I will take a note of one difference. You said COIN is the situation, what to do is the strategy. I'll say the insurgency, if you want to continue the analogy, the insurgency is the situation. A COIN is an operation. It's an operational kind of thing. The strategy is thinking about what are we doing the COIN for at the end. So we're doing COIN to get to some kind of resolution. And whether it's promulgated, not promulgated, covert, clandestine, overt, whatever, I think that is the real crux of finding out what happens or what comes next after insurgency and COIN. And as we talk about these things, it's kind of 3 phases of how we talk about conflict in general, is how we get in, how we conduct, and how we get out. And I think all of that is inextricably linked to what did we want to get out of it in the first case. So after a long introduction, and again, a caveat, I'm going to bring up three topics, three situations. I'm not the subject matter expert on the internal, current, or past politics of El Salvador, the Philippines, or Libya. There is a man to my right who probably is, but I am not that. But of course, I was there in some capacity, and this will kind of be a wave top. So in El Salvador, how did we get in? Well, there was a long history of economic and sociological grievances amongst the mass majority of the El Salvadoran population. When it gained independence from Spain, it was joined the Central American contingency of essentially former colonies, and then set up its own state. At one time, at that time, 1% of the population owned 60% of the land. 80% of the population owned nothing, literally nothing. There was not as much as in other Latin American countries. There was also the mestizo Indian population that was a little bit less or more disadvantaged. Generally the white Spanish population tended to have the power. But that in the early 60s, that gave ground for kind of a leftist fertile ground, if you will, the pond where the fish can swim. And then Cuba actually was one of their success stories of what they wanted to do was kind of independent from the Soviet Union, is kind of fund, support the communist movement in El Salvador, FMLN. So the U.S. entry then comes in it can't be overstated, the post-Vietnam aspect of this. So we have the Vietnam fatigue, kind of analogous to something that we might be facing today. But this time it's in our backyard. The communist dominoes are falling, and we don't want them to come up Latin America into Mexico, and then communist regimes in New Mexico and Arizona are next. So we want to do something. So we start low-level support. A right-wing government, a right-wing coup takes over, a junta, if you will. And we see this as, okay, it's repressive, but they promise some human rights. So it's actually Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. jump on board to fund this El Salvadoran government. It was actually Carter who did the rapid increase of about $5 million, which was a lot back then, to fund the El Salvadoran government. But then at the kind of through the Civil War, you can't oversay how brutal it was. Everything that's happening in ISIS, in the Middle East, the beheadings, all that kind of blatant brutality, that was every day for 10, 15 years in El Salvador. I mean, it was brutal on both sides. It was right wing and left wing that were kind of the bad guys there. Yada yada yada. It goes on for a long time. I won't go into the details because I really want to get to what happened next and how did we get out. It's kind of coincidental. It just happened that the Cold War ended. Nobody expected it. Cold War ended, and that affected both sides. First of all, the FMLN still had a vocal supporter in Cuba, but really some of the money and some of the actual support had started to dry up. More importantly, though, the kind of the rightish parties and the business leaders in El Salvador who kind of controlled the political party, they kind of saw that this wasn't getting them anywhere. So the U.S. lost interest. We kind of the left Democratic pressures in Congress, the human rights groups put a lot of pressure for the U.S. that we couldn't go big. And we kind of lost, with the end of the Cold War, we didn't see that as a Cold War battleground anymore. So we kind of lost interest, and what that is more important is that we weren't really getting involved to perpetuate anything anymore. So what happened was that the El Salvadorians actually figured it out. And I'll say that as we go through these three examples, I kind of have a win-lose draw. And El Salvador, if you study the international counterinsurgency movements, it's really one of the few successes. And I'll put that in past tense. I'll talk about that in just a second. But it only worked because the El Salvadorans wanted a political solution. There weren't these highly embedded sectarian differences. There could have been racial and definitely sociological economic differences to exploit, but the El Salvadorans got over that. And it worked because the government reintegrated the FMLN into society. So they were recognized as a legal political party, and then as a mechanism to, for the military, actually to achieve a political aim, they used the military to, as one of the springboards, the military and the police, to actually reintegrate former FMLN battalions into the Salvadoran army, and over a series, over some time, then just one army and one police force. And then so that's a success, except unfortunately lately the drug war has kind of taken a toll on what we would see as a successful political process. But the demobilizing, dearmament, reintegration, DDR, as we say, was actually a success. Qualified, but a success. Okay, I'll jump forward to the Philippines. My experience there started 2001. The kind of the history there, I won't go into long detail, but if you know U.S. history in Southeast Asia, we have a long and complicated history with the Philippines. And various types of repression within the Philippines that set the conditions for a disaffected population in the South. Mindanao, unfortunately, is on one of Huntington's lines, the Clash of Civilizations, where starting in about the 1200s, 1300s, when Arab traders came that far east, they kind of set up there's a distinctly separate Muslim culture in the southern Mindanao. But unfortunately, also that was kind of the rice basket of the Philippines. Had some of the highest rice yields, and in the 70s, Luzon and some of the other islands were facing high population stresses. Marcos then started a policy of kind of expropriating the land in Mindanao, giving people from Luzon, Christians, Catholics, that land to go farm and release some of those population strains. So that brought in conflict with the Muslims down south. So there were a number of parties that formed. Noor Miswari, who actually started the MNLF, kind of in the early 60s, led into some splinter groups. The two big ones are the MILF and the Abu Sayyaf group. We kind of get involved in it. So we were actually out of the Philippines in 1991. Mount Pinatubo explodes. Again, post-Cold War, we don't necessarily need the bases in Clark and Subic Bay as much. The Philippines were going through their own nationalist political swings and generally wanted us out. And so it was too expensive to repair Clark and Subic Bay, so we said, now's a good time to leave. 2001, when 9/11 happens, Arroyo was actually the first national leader to come out in virtually unqualified support for the Bush global war on terrorism. And as a reward, what the U.S. did is we expanded a standing military exercise, special operations exercise called Balikatan, and we trained it and we turned it into a kind of a train man and assist through, by, and with the Philippine Army of the Philippines, the AFP, and but there were a couple of hurdles that we couldn't go full out operations. One is we were focused in Afghanistan at that time, and we didn't want to open up two major theaters. The second part was there's a Philippine constitution that after Clark Subic, after our withdrawal, has a clause in it that says no foreigners can conduct combat operations in the Philippine soil. Now, for most Westphalian states, that's obvious. No foreign power should be able to conduct military operations on your soil, but in the Philippines, there was that colonial legacy with the U.S. that it was directed specifically at us. The government, and the military wanted to try and work around that, but whatever. We could do all the training up to what we call the line of departure, let the Philippine Army go do their thing, and then once they come back from the objective, we could rejoin up with them. So, but that was in kind of how we ramp up to things. That was kind of a medium crisis. September 11th was unexpected, but we had a couple of months to mobilize and do the recon, set the policy, get all of that straight. I would say we kept it, again, low level, but it was the whole through by and with. Some of the cultural aspects in the Philippines, there are severe sectarian differences, and it's amazing that they actually have come to a peace. I don't know if you all know it, the Philippine Army, or the government of the Philippines, with the help of the Malaysians, did sign a truce with the MILF back in January. So that is, I call that a draw right now, because the verdict is actually still out on whether they'll actually get this Bangsamoro, this Muslim self-autonomous region. So that I would say that's the draw. In Libya, I think it's better known here, so I won't go into the long history. But on the continuum of planning to crisis entry, I would say from all of the big operations that we've done lately, Libya is the crisis of all crisis entry operations. The Arab Spring hit everybody by surprise. It kind of in December through March, we should have been preparing for it, but it really, the whole situation in Libya started moving very, very, very quickly. And it was, Gaddafi sent his son out to put down the rebellion in Benghazi, and we in the West, the U.S. specifically, were in a no-win situation, either genocide in Benghazi, or we have to get involved in yet another Middle East conflict. But to understand how we got into that, you have to understand two of the Obama administration legacies. First is there a strong contingent of Democrats from the Clinton administration who made it very, very vocal, very public, there will be no more Rwandas, Burundi Rwandas on our watch. It will not happen. And they were looking at it right then at that time. But counter to that was the same people and other advisors. We want to end the Bush wars. We want to send a new way of doing business with military operations and U.S. foreign policy. So that was a dilemma that was very difficult for them to work through. And it really didn't get worked through definitively until, quite honestly, the French sent out two fighters and bombed an advanced convoy, and then game on. Then later on, the U.S. and the British start off the conflict with large salvos of cruise missiles, again, avoiding overflight, avoiding boots on the ground. And there was, of course, preparatory that to get the whole UN resolution as well. How we get out, so if there's a win, lose, or draw, Libya, I say right now, is the big lose. I don't see a way out. Living next door, I see Tunisia as a bright hope, but impossible to overcome, potentially impossible to overcome the black hole that's next door to them. One of the things that when we got in, we understood that there were tribal differences. We did not understand the effect that the latent tribal differences would have on setting up a stable Libyan regime post-U.S. operations. So with that, I'll just, I think my time is about over. So these are kind of the things that questions I wanted to bring up. Of how we get in, and more importantly then, how we also get out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I think that it's so important to have not just concrete case studies, but to have the perspective of time and see how much of this is really determined by international constraints and momentary transient political decisions, and sometimes things that we don't think about or not aware of at the relevant decision-making point, we can look in retrospect and see the complexity of this. I would invite you to think, when we come to the discussion, whether, looking at these three cases, El Salvador, relatively small, conflict is basically over, and the United States is able to do peace building rather than peacemaking, if you like. Very different kind of context from current day Iraq and Syria and Libya. And so as we think about this in the context of the Middle East, it'll be interesting to see what are the historical precedents that we can realistically learn from, and what are those that are just simply not applicable to this to states this size, with this amount of ethnic complexity and so on and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for that. That's enormously useful and helpful. I want to turn now to Professor Tim Hoyt. I had the pleasure of having Professor Hoyt with us in a workshop on state failure last year, and he even coined the term, in my mind at least, on strategic under-governance, which I've been playing with and my students have been playing with over the past academic year. So it was very fruitful last year, and always a great pleasure to have you with us. Professor Tim Hoyt is the professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, beautiful part of the world. He's been there since 2002 and was named the John Nicholas Brown Chair of Counter-Terrorism in 2011. He lectures and teaches there on a range of topics, including strategy, terrorism, insurgency, warfare, weapons of mass destruction, and contemporary conflict. Professor Hoyt received his PhD in International Relations and Strategic Studies from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in 1997. From 1998 until 2002, he taught graduate courses on security in the developing world, Southeast Asia, technology and international security, and the list goes on and on. His recent publications include chapters and articles on the war on terrorism in South Asia, security and conflict in the developing world, and the limits of military force in the global war on terrorism. Professor Hoyt, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Well, first off, thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Amichai, for inviting me again. Thank you to the family for all you have given. And for all that you continue to give. It is difficult to talk about a topic as broad as what happens after counterinsurgency. It's an enormous topic. What I thought I would do is take a slice of it. Before I begin, I have to also offer the same disclaimer. What I say reflects my own views, not those of the U.S. Navy, the Naval War College, the Department of Defense, or any other element of the U.S. government. That allows me to speak freely and, if possible, offend many of you. What I would like to talk about is, first I'd like to make two statements about COIN. When we talk about COIN, every counterinsurgency is different. So the idea of creating principles are to provide guidance, not to provide a list of what to do and what not to do, and it's very important to remember that. The second is that U.S. policy for over 100 years in terms of counterinsurgency has always been in the context of intervening in somebody else's insurgency. And that's important because that's very different from what the COIN literature is talking about. The COIN literature is about what a state needs to do to resist internal revolt. The role that the U.S. plays, however, is that of an outsider coming in to help someone else resist that internal revolt or rebellion. And that is a complicating factor. It's a very important complicating factor. What I'd like to do is to vastly oversimplify this problem and talk about a debate in the United States about how the U.S. intervenes in other people's insurgencies. And this is really about two ends of a spectrum of possible U.S. intervention. I'm going to refer to it as big footprint COIN and small footprint COIN. Because this is a debate that's been going on in the United States for over 60 years. about how best do we contribute to the building of states and helping them resist internal revolution, dating back to the Cold War period. This is where the special forces began to get the job of training and later fighting insurgents in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It's a part of the U.S. continuous military experience since 1964 in Vietnam all the way up through today. When the U.S. intervenes to help an ally or partner against an internal threat, do we go in big and heavy, or do we go in small? And that's an important set of distinctions. Each has strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to talk about them very briefly in terms of short-term costs and benefits, but also in terms of longer-term risks and consequences, because the way in which you intervene has both short and long-term aspects. Big footprint counterinsurgency, I would argue we're moving out of now. We have recently ended a big footprint campaign in Iraq. We are ending a big footprint campaign in Afghanistan. We've also had an experience in Vietnam from 1964 to 1973 that's well known. There are short-term costs and benefits that make big footprint coin look very attractive. First off, the US military is a very good military. We're very good at going in and breaking things and killing people. That's what militaries are designed to do in the first case. It's also what the US military has been very good at since the early 1940s. There are costs to big footprint coin, and those costs are substantial, and some of them are upfront, right? There's a high economic cost. If the United States says we're going to move large numbers of troops into a foreign country, that has high economic costs. When the US moves large numbers of troops into a foreign country, that is going to boost the casualty cost for the US, because for the first time we're engaged in combat, but also for everyone in the area, because when you move large military forces into an area, it increases casualties. Combat goes up, more people die. That has longer-term costs from a humanitarian perspective. A large US footprint means more people die in a shorter period of time. That has long-term political costs. It also has a considerable strain, particularly more recently, in terms of military deployments and personnel strain in the United States All-Volunteer Force. Teaching at the Naval War College, I've had students come through who've served 7 or 8 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Right, that is a very high personnel strain. It's high strain on the families, it's high strain on the operators. Those are costs that begin almost immediately and continue to accrue throughout the campaign. However, big footprint coin also has apparent benefits, right? You use it as a tool of crisis management. When it looks like a state is about to fail, throw in 5 digits worth of US combat forces, and things begin to change. There are apparent short-term operational and tactical gains because US military forces come in and immediately begin heavy operations to resist whatever the insurgent factions are, and those initial operations will be quite successful because we're going to come in big and heavy. There are temporary reputation gains. Reputation gains matter more when you're a great power who has to operate all over the international system. When the United States sends in a large ground force to support an ally, at least initially, that shows that the United States is a reliable ally. It shows that the United States still bears a commitment to the stability of the international system and will not allow our allies to fail. It also means that the United States in the theater gains greater control of military operations because essentially we co-opt control of military operations from the host nation. By putting in large numbers of forces, we begin to take over the war, at least initially. And we impose much higher costs on the enemy again. Last but not least, a large US force imposes fewer demands on host capacity. We, in essence, replace the need for the host, at least in the short term, to develop more robust governance, more robust military forces and capability, and more robust legitimacy, right? The United States acts as a substitute for that for a brief period of time. So as a short-term option, big footprint coin has a certain amount of attraction. Now, small footprint coin, and the classic example of this is the El Salvador campaign that John was referring to earlier. By statute, the US could not have more than 55 people in El Salvador at any time. Now, there were ways in which we got around that with half-year deployments and a whole variety of other things, so there actually were more people. But U.S. forces were precluded from combat, at least in theory, and were substantially restrained in numbers. And one of my colleagues at the Naval War College was the leader of that mission, and he said one of the big advantages to having only 55 people deployed in El Salvador was that when the El Salvadoran government committed atrocities, which it did on a fairly regular basis, at least early in the conflict, he could literally say, I am going to put the entire team on a plane and we will be back in Miami in 2 hours. So either change your behavior or we are gone and aid is over. That is powerful leverage. It does not necessarily provide powerful combat capability. The costs of a small footprint coin in the short term are higher host costs because the host nation has to do a lot of fighting. There is no substitution factor where you move in a more capable large military force. The host nation still has to fight. There are possible moral costs. El Salvador had very high moral costs. I'm old enough to remember the debate about El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 1980s and the concerns about death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, which were very active, very effective, and very public. That also has reputation costs for the United States. El Salvador, at least in theory, was a neighbor and an ally, but we were only moving in with a very small footprint, and we were not preventing them from doing bad things. That hurt the United States' reputation in the international community, and it caused domestic problems at home. Also, small footprint requires greater cooperation with and tolerance of the host government and of the military. It is more complicated. However, there are some substantial benefits, again, in the short term. There are lower U.S. costs in terms of casualties, in terms of expenditures. The U.S. can focus on training rather than combat, which again will keep casualties relatively lower in most cases, and may play to a strength where our professional military troops and advisors can help expand the capacity more rapidly of host forces. It may create, over time, better host capacity and legitimacy, and it may limit enemy mobilization. One of the risks, I'm going to move to the longer term risks and consequences, one of the risks of big footprint coin is that when you put a large American troop presence into a country, it delegitimizes the existing government. It proves that the existing government is not capable of maintaining control of its own security, and that will play into the hands of insurgents. So the longer there's a big US force in country, the more in subtle ways you are supporting actually insurgent claims that the host government is inadequate, is somehow a foreign element, and is dominated by an American colonial presence. Other risks of big footprint coin. Once you put a lot of American troops in, host governments tend to free ride. They feel like the Americans will do it for them. You know, if you have 150,000 American troops, you don't have to work as hard to train your own troops. You can pad rosters in host military units. You don't have to train as hard. You don't have to take as many risks because you know if you can't get it done, the Americans will come and get it done for you. In addition, again, large numbers of American forces tend to increase collateral losses, in part because when we put a lot of forces in country, we use a lot of firepower. Even when we try and restrain that firepower, it will tend to have public effects that look as though we're creating disproportionate civilian casualties. That then has a series of corollary effects, spin-on effects, that will make big footprint coin look less effective over time. The first is, again, civilian losses delegitimizes the host country. If Americans are in your country killing your own people, the government doesn't look legitimate. Second is it will contribute to enemy mobilization over time. Because civilians are getting killed, the families of those civilians will tend to be resentful and may want to strike back. It also, again, the delegitimization process has a corollary effect of legitimizing anyone who's fighting against the government. Third, civilian casualties will then lead to increased U.S. domestic opposition. Because after some time, U.S. domestic politics become less and less accepting of civilian casualties, less and less accepting of things that look immoral in the international system. The consequences of that for big footprint coin are actually quite significant. The first is you can't sustain big footprint coin. You just can't keep it going for very long. It has a series of inevitable effects that make it less and less popular and less likely to be sustained both domestically, in the host country, and in the international system. That leads to a possible perception of failure or inconstancy on the part of the United States government, because we will put in big footprint coin, but we won't keep it there forever and solve the problem. At some point, it reaches diminishing returns, and we have to begin drawing down those forces and withdrawing. Big footprint coin slows host nation capacity and development. It may even raise resentment not only from the insurgents, but from the host government and population, which leads over time to a significant degradation in the ability of the United States to continue to assist in the region. We've seen that, for instance, in Iraq. We tried to draw down forces in limited ways, and then we were unable to get a status of forces agreement out of an Iraqi democratic government, which would protect our troops in the event that they went into combat. That meant that our troops had no legal protections once they were in Iraq, which means we can't leave our troops in Iraq. Rather than going from 150,000 to 30,000 or 15,000, we went from 150,000 to 0 much more quickly. That explains part of the problems that we face today. Overall, big footprint coin is a Band-Aid. It's not surgery. It's something you can do immediately that'll have an impact, but it comes at very high political and economic cost. And that's something we have to remember, because right now, there are a number of people who are arguing that big footprint coin really is the solution. If we could only keep 150,000 troops in Iraq forever, it would become a better place. Well, that's very problematic politically and economically. In terms of small footprint coin, over the longer term, if you can get past the immediate crisis, it begins actually to look better and better if you're concerned about state building. There are risks with small footprint coin. It looks as though the United States is not particularly committed. It is possible that your hosts will not be adequate to win. And that may force a later crisis decision about, do I commit more or not? At the same time, while it may not immediately stop insurgent growth, it does tend to give greater legitimacy to the existing regime. It provides greater capacity over time to the existing regime. And one thing that's very important, it does not promise decisive results. It promises results through attrition or exhaustion. Now, that's unpleasant. As military people, we tend to like to think of, how do I get decisive results? You don't get decisive results in an insurgency. Insurgencies take years to combat. You can have operational success, but you can't have decisive operational success. That slower operational impact, however, may allow the development of greater governance, of greater legitimacy, and of greater capacity over time. And that builds the state so that the state will be more stable, which ultimately is the objective when you intervene for coin. Your political objective is to create an environment where the state on whose behalf you intervene is more stable and successful, and the insurgency is less of a threat. Consequences. You can maintain small footprint coin a lot longer and at a lot less political and economic cost. It may be able to survive domestic mood swings in the United States because it does have a small footprint. It is a small expenditure. It appears to be help rather than dominance. It allows more control over the commitment. It's much easier to expand a force if you need to than to shrink it once it's enormous. It has very different political costs. And most important, it provides greater host agency. There's less control over what the host does, but there's more leverage in some ways. And over time, you will have more positive effects more quickly on the host government and on the military. Now, I would caution you about a couple of things, because these enter constantly into the public debate over coin. There are two very bad analogies about state building and its relationship to American troop presence. And I'm going to leave you with this, because we should never leave on a happy note. The first is, lots of people use the post-World War II successes in Germany and Japan as examples of state building after war. This is how coin should end. Well, those are really bad examples. The United States and its allies occupied Germany and Japan in 1945 after a 6-year war in the case of Germany and a 4-year war in the case of Japan, where both societies were destroyed. And when I say destroyed, I mean destroyed. Aerial bombing, millions of civilian fatalities. In the case of Japan, a year or more of naval blockade that reduced the food supply to starvation rations. I mean, these countries were brutally defeated, for a very good reason, by the way. I don't have any hard feelings about it. But occupying those states was very different than the circumstances we currently face in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was no resistance in Germany. There was none. There were no guerrilla activities. There was no insurgent activity. There was none in Japan. We had a peaceful occupation because we had crushed the societies. They felt they were defeated, and they accepted occupation. That is not the case in Iraq and Afghanistan. Another analogy that's being used right now, and it's by my good friend John Nagel. John says, well, if we'd only left 50,000 troops in Iraq the way we did in Korea, in 40 years, Iraq might be a democracy. Okay, well, first off, we don't know what Iraq's going to look like in 40 years, whether we leave 50,000 troops there or not. That's an unknown. But second, again, remember in Korea, we were there at the invitation of the government. We were there with the full support of the Korean people because we had not only defended them against North Korean and Chinese aggression, we had liberated them from North Korean and Chinese aggression. They were glad to have us there. And last but not least, our role in Korea was and remains defense against an external enemy. The troops that we leave in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are leaving to continue the fight against insurgents. They will be, if they stay there, engaged in active combat operations within the country, and will still have some of these long-term negative effects that any outsider will have in another country carrying out military operations. So that would be the thing I would leave you with. This debate between big and footprint coin, it will continue. And there are going to be times when each might be appropriate for the United States, depending on the nature of the crisis. But in the future, comparing these things and their aftermaths to Korea and to the Second World War is inappropriate, because those were not counterinsurgencies at the end of the day. Those were occupations or presence by invitation. And that's a very different state of affairs. And with that, I'll leave you so we have some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think we can begin to see the interplay also between the different presentations. I just want to highlight, John mentioned El Salvador. We could also mention, as an example of a success, we could also mention Colombia and the very limited and focused security sector reform assistance received by the Colombian government in the mid-1990s that helped, together with domestic political change in Colombia, push back the FARC, and eventually, over a decade, really improve things. People forget, but in the 1994, Bogota basically, came under rocket fire by the FARC. So we do have examples of success. I might also mention Liberia. Let me mention that there's a very good study by Jim Dobbins on state building and when does it work. And I think it feeds in very, very well to this conversation, and hopefully gives us some more tools for being even more depressed about the Middle East. And Jim Dobbins sort of looks at, I think, close to 50 international, US and then UN attempts at state building in the post-Second World War period. I entirely agree with you that Japan and Germany are terrible examples, not only for the very excellent reasons that you mentioned, Tim, but also these were highly industrialized and homogeneous societies even before the war, none of the sectarian differences and so on. But what Jim Dobbins discovers is that state building works under two conditions. First of all, it works in small places. Think East Timor, think Kosovo, think about El Salvador, right? It's an entirely 150,000 troops for Kosovo is a very different kind of game than 150,000 troops for Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, okay? So it works in small places. It also works when the protagonists in the country, either one side has totally defeated the other, right? Or they're ready to reach some kind of political accommodation, and so you come in at the time when the population and the leadership is ready to move forward politically. If you step into a situation where that is not the case, where you have an active insurgency, a domestic insurgency, a local insurgency, and we haven't even begun to touch on the very important issue of external assistance to the insurgents, and which is a major factor in, of course, in Syria and Iraq, the Iranian factor, the Russian factor, and so on and so forth, it becomes much more difficult. And I think we're beginning to see the themes, so coin and state building appropriate, perhaps under certain circumstances, and I thank you for making the distinction between heavy foot and light foot. I thought it was very, very useful. I think hopefully our next speaker, Professor Heidi Lane, will further lead us down the road to identifying some of these key themes. Professor Heidi Lane is an associate professor of strategy and policy and director of the Greater Middle East Research Study Group at the U.S. Naval War College, also in Newport, Rhode Island. Guys, I envy you. I spent a semester as an undergraduate at Brown University, and man, Newport is gorgeous. She's conducted extensive field research in the Middle East, including as research affiliate with the Truman Institution here in Israel at the Hebrew University, as a U.S. Fulbright scholar in Syria. She was a research fellow with the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University from 2010 to 2012. And she's currently a senior associate at the Center for Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups at the Naval War College. Her areas of specialization are ethnic and religious nationalism. We haven't touched on the religious and sectarian aspects as much as I would have liked to. I don't know if we'll have time for that today, but they're clearly important. Insurgency, terrorism, and de-radicalization. She's currently completing research on a book manuscript about the effects of counter-terrorism programs on state liberalization in the Middle East. And she's also the co-editor of a new manuscript titled The Rule of Law in the Arab World in the Transition, an Arab World in Transition, to be published in 2014. And Heidi, is this the first time you're here at the conference, at the ICT conference? No. Second time? Third time. Not in my workshop. But פעם שלישית גלידה. הופה, יפה. יותר מקומית ממני. Heidi is delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amichai. And thank you for the panelists, and to Dr. Magen. And thank you to the Ragonis family. I think this is the second time, kavod li. The topic I'm going to discuss this morning, I hope, gets a little bit more to what I think are my opinions about the after coin. And I should also actually say that I also offer the disclaimer that these are my opinions, and everything that Tim said I second that. These are my opinions, not those of the Department of Defense. So my objective this morning is to talk about the after coin and what I conceive of as potential barriers, conceptual and practical, but maybe more on the practical side, because the conceptual is easier maybe to navigate, but to arriving at this place that we want to call after coin. And I think we should remind ourselves, I want to note also that I am not legally trained, and I know some of you are, and there was a very good panel yesterday on this, and I think Amichai has that background. I'm a political scientist, and so you grow up in that discipline learning a lot about state building, and you kind of cut your teeth on people like Charles Tilly, for example, many of you here may be familiar with him. Well, it's easy to forget, I think, in this era when we've been doing counterinsurgency and the war on terror, that state building in Charles Tilly's conception is not this touchy-feely thing that is about the nice, peaceful period after a war. It does come after a war, but it is very much a non-normative term. It doesn't have a good side or necessarily a bad side. It's about state consolidation and making sure that those people who win the war are then able to hold on to what they fought for. So I want to remind everybody of that, because I think we get a little bit too far into thinking of state building as something else. And one of the reasons I would say that especially is because when you look at the cases that are mainly in Middle East states, what you see is that it is not touchy-feely necessarily, and the institutions and many of the practices that have been institutionalized are something other than democratic, and in my opinion, continue to be so. So how I came to this subject was a little bit circuitous, and it does have to do with the co-edited book that Amichai mentioned. And we convened a bunch of scholars at the Naval War College to look at what I thought was a very interesting question, which is what's happening. We know that the Arab Spring is happening, and whether you call it revolution or something else, government institutions are changing. So we wanted to look at how are they changing and what did they look like before, because there is actually not as robust as you would like evidence of how some of the institutions worked before the revolution. For example, what were the practices in the judiciary? How did police look at, for example, crowd control? Very sort of tactical in some cases, but have strategic relevance. And the scholars were asked to look at 4 areas: judiciary, police, regulatory, policy, and then the military. And at the time of the conference, and now it's even a little bit more pronounced, this was mainly Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and Yemen. And you can begin to start adding to this list to some extent. So they were asked to describe how things were evolving or not evolving in these areas, and then what would happen after transition. So, you ask yourself, what does this have to do with coin, especially in the Middle East? Well, in my opinion, it has everything to do with coin, because in 4 of the 5 countries I mentioned, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, these are experiencing insurgencies as we speak, not to speak of terrorism. And I hope we can kind of raise the issue of what the linkage is between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, because in many cases I don't think there's a very clear line, particularly in the countries I'm looking at. So in 2 of these countries, the US and other nations have overtly committed resources to coin, and in all 5, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency is both a mission and a part of a broader US and, as of today, an increasingly international objective. So, where did I leave off here? So like most things, getting to the after part of coin depends very exclusively on how you define the problem. And in many of these states, defining what's happening on the ground, what is happening that they call insurgency is very different. So I'm going to keep this quite limited because we're running out of time to have a good discussion. But the main questions I want to raise are, when is it time to say that coin should be stopped? And taking a look at these cases, we'll want to talk a little bit about the Algeria case in a moment, because that's an excellent case, somewhat complete, of a nation that went through a very long insurgency, applied a very active and deep coin response to that insurgency, and then set about state building. And I think in the case of the Algerians, very much state building that has coin, in essence, and counterterrorism as its centerpiece. So when is it time to let coin be behind you? Let me just pose some hypothetical endpoints using some of the nations, roughly. For example, will Yemen's insurgency, currently ongoing, evidence of this, of course, is the Saudi embassy closed yesterday and evacuated all their personnel. When will it be ended? Is that when there will be no violence in Yemen? How will you measure no violence? And more importantly, who will be the measurers? And then how will it be facilitated? And I say, how will the endpoint be facilitated? Will it be enforced? And what will be the foundation on which to build enduring institutions that are committed to the rule of law? To say nothing of institutions that have integrity and a potential to actually have some longevity. Another case, that's if the violence ends. If violence were to decline and not actually end, which I think if you look at a whole number of cases just in the Middle East region, but also in other places, we're never talking about violence completely ending. We're talking about a low enough management of the problem to begin to allow for what they call after coin. And if that's the case, when is that slow burn stage met? And is it possible to build rule of law or to have these institutions if you, for example, only control part of a state? And I think that's a very common outcome too. Certainly the Israeli case over many years is very, with respect to the Palestinian territories and to Gaza, there's a lot of evidence there that controlling part of it may be enough. The management may be enough to call it quits, at least, or let's say operational pause. So in that context, let me just say a few words then about linkage between coin and counterterrorism. And this gets a little bit more to where my main emphasis of research is. And in many circles, these are theoretically very different things. You know, you really have people who do, especially in the US at this point, do counter-insurgency, and in doctrinal terms, it can be very differently defined from counterterrorism. But I think in practice, these tools are very different. In practice, I don't think those tools are very exclusive. I think they're used interchangeably in some cases, and this gets to whether or not they are distinguishable then in the institutions that grow out of coin. For example, the US and the international coalition employed coin in post-Saddam Iraq, but the current deployment of US advisors in Iraq has a little bit more to do with counterterrorism, maybe until this morning, when the President of the United States, I guess it was yesterday, unveiled a different kind of strategy that is maybe more committed to coin again. This is an ever more gray area when nations taking the lead in coin or in counterterrorism have not, like the US, had the opportunity or the impetus to distinguish between these roles on either a narrative level, and what I mean by narrative here, because someone yesterday said they didn't like the term narrative, what I mean by narrative level is what goes into your national security documents, how you express what it is your objective is going to be within that part of government. You know, what you say you're going to do. So whether on a narrative level or on a practical level through the division of labor between institutions. For example, and this is again getting back to Algeria, which suffered a decade-long insurgency and employed one of the most brutal counter-insurgency campaigns ever, to be followed by an extremely robust counterterrorism infrastructure that persists today and is led by President Bouteflika, of course, who currently is in, I believe, his 16th year of office and doesn't appear to be having any intention of leaving. I mean, to the degradation of the constitution of Algeria and the degradation of what had become a hope in post-conflict Algeria that there would be a transition. So, to sort of sum up my main arguments, I think this is an area that is going to see lots and lots of work the topic of after, the nature of state building, and distinguishing it from what nation building is, because there's really very different impressions of state building versus nation building, and to really maybe delve much deeper into the topic that Amichai so nicely set up as the basis for this panel. Predictively, and again, social science can predict and then change their mind next year at the 15th ICT conference, but I do not expect a clear transition in terms of the rule of law issues from coin to post-coin, at least in many of the Arab Spring instances. And at the War College, we often use the very famous German theorist Clausewitz. I guess German would be iffy, but German-speaking at that time, who always says the result of war is never final. Very common dictum, if you've been anywhere near military circles, you're going to have heard this quite a lot. If I were an optimist about that Clausewitzian dictum, I would argue that with regard to the result of insurgency and then counter-insurgency as a response, having results that are not final, that is, some end state that is not final, may actually be a healthy and necessary process towards a better peace, which is what Clausewitz is after. That is, the not holding too close to what that state building process should be afterwards. If I had a pessimistic view of the aftermath of coin, that is, if the institutions that are left behind by counterinsurgency, and in some cases by long and very invested counterterrorism campaigns, these will not advance the rule of law, and beyond completely bureaucratizing what is essentially an extension of coin for the state. And in that way, then, coin, as it stands and is written in the joint publication 3-24, which Amichai mentioned, it will not reach its ultimate objective, because it is to simultaneously defeat, through comprehensive civilian and military efforts, defeat and contain insurgency, but then move on to building governance. And the state building process, if it simply embodies the practices of coin and doesn't move beyond that, then will not actually have fulfilled what the original objective was. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi, both for raising the Algerian case, which I think is will increasingly be on people's minds. I mean, as we go forward, hopefully towards stabilization in the next few years in Iraq and Syria. It's a big if, but also in pointing out this kind of gray zone and really an area that is under-researched and under-theorized, and that is this, how does one transition from a situation of insurgency and, immediate post-insurgency to longer-term governance provision and state building, and for suggesting that this, as we tend to like in the West, especially kind of neat divisions and categories and solutions, and that may not be the case, and it might be much more kind of messy, at least for prolonged periods and times than we've grown accustomed to thinking. Our last, but not least, by no means panelist, and we're very delighted and honored to have him with us. This panel is Professor Nicholas Rostow. Many of you in the room really needs no introduction, but let me just mention a couple of highlights in a very long and distinguished both academic and public service career. Professor Rostow is currently the Distinguished Research Professor at the National Defense University, specializing in international and national security law and the affairs of the United States government and international decision-making in foreign and national security policy. He's also a senior research scholar at Yale Law School. His public service positions are really incredibly interesting and long and diverse. He served as the General Counsel and Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Permanent Representative in the United Nations between 2001 and 2005. He was the Staff Director at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence between 1999 and 2000, Counsel and Deputy Staff Director to the House Select Committee on Military and Commercial Concerns with the People's Republic of China between 1998 and 1999. He was a special assistant to President Reagan and George H.W. Bush for national security affairs and a legal advisor to the National Security Council under Colin Powell. And I can go on and on, but in the interest of time, let me just say that he, in a way, has the most fun but also difficult task of trying to pull some of this together and drawing on his vast academic and public policy experience in trying to think perhaps about future policy directions in this context. So Professor Russell, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you very much. I also, since I work for the Defense Department, and indeed they paid my way over here, I have to have a disclaimer that what I'm going to say are my own views, not those of the U.S. government. Indeed, the U.S. government has no views, as we know, so that doesn't matter. We meet on 9/11, and it's very important to remember, I think, that without 9/11, we wouldn't have gone into Afghanistan, and we would not have gone into Iraq in 2003. And so we wouldn't probably be having this discussion. Although a lot of the issues that have been raised are of enduring, indeed ancient significance. Let me begin with some preliminary remarks, because our subject really is what to do about violence as a political instrument, because that's what insurgency is. It is a political activity using violence. It may use terrorism, it may use other legitimate or illegitimate means, but above all, it involves violence. And insurgency itself is a neutral term relative, say, to terrorism. You can talk to an insurgent. You can negotiate a deal. It's very, once you label someone a terrorist or a génocidaire, it's very difficult to sit down and have a conversation with him, which is a problem when one gets to the state building and nation building issues that Heidi talked about. When I say it's ancient, in this part of the world, the Romans thought the Jews were insurgents. The Jews at the time didn't have the benefit of external support, and the Romans put down the insurgency with a high degree of savagery. And that's worth remembering. From the British point of view, the Americans in the 1770s were insurgents. The Americans benefited from French assistance. Without it, the British would have won. French assistance bankrupted France and was one of the causes of the French Revolution. The American Civil War, from a certain point of view, was an insurgency. The South didn't benefit from external assistance. Since World War II, insurgencies have been generally in a colonial, post-colonial, but above all, a Cold War context. And unless one recalls the context, then one doesn't really understand why bother. And that's why I started with 9/11, because the important operational aspects of counterinsurgency that Tim Hoyt talked about only take on significance if it's important. I mean, why do it if it's not important to you? And if it's important to you, why is it important to you as the United States? And Eitan, I mean, your comments about Israel were profoundly significant and highlight what I perceive to be an extraordinary, well, it may be my own ignorance, actually, but a perception of a gap in Israeli approaches to its security problems, which tends to be too unidimensional, and they're not taking the hearts and minds issue seriously enough, sort of having given up on it. Well, I don't think it's too late, and I don't think they should give up on it. And there are various ways in which they might work on the messaging received by the Palestinians. But of course, the problems Israel confronts in the territories and in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere would be different if their enemies weren't supported by other enemies. I mean, if Hamas didn't have external support, it wouldn't be able to do what it does, and the same goes for other enemies of Israel. Second thing that's important, I think, to recall in all of this is that, and it's a point that Tim made, it's if you're an enemy of the United States and you want to force the United States to do or not do something, what are you going to do? And if violence is one of your chosen instruments. Take on the 82nd Airborne straight up, or the 1st Division? I don't think so. My present boss is an ex-infantry officer who says nothing can stop 100 M1A1 tanks coming right at you at 60 miles an hour firing as they go. They just can't be stopped. So I don't think that's the right approach. Insurgency, however, with all the dimensions involved is a perfectly reasonable instrument if you're an enemy of the United States and or Israel or any other quasi-status quo power, and it poses enormous challenges. So one of the things that I worry about is are we going to learn the lessons of the last decade, identify the lessons, and learn them? Or are we just going to do what we did in Vietnam after Vietnam, which was close the book and throw it away and say never again, and we're not going to learn anything from it either? The current mantra of the U.S. military official, well, the most senior officers, is we're not going to do counterinsurgency operations again, period. Well, that requires the other team to play fair or be dumb. I guess what I take from the presentations today is, first of all, the need for governments who confront an insurgency or whose allies confront an insurgency to answer and be very precise about the usual questions. What are you trying to achieve? In what context and with what means? And to me, the infuriating tragedy of the last decade and a half is those questions, from the American perspective, were not properly addressed, or they were allowed to change. So, to take Afghanistan, the goal at the beginning of the operation, as stated by President Bush, was we want Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar. And for my money, we should have said, that's what we're going in to get. We're going to get them, and when we've gotten them and have their heads on pikes, we're leaving. And if you are once again a staging ground for this kind of activity, all hell will be paid. But instead, we allowed ourselves to begin to think bigger in terms of, well, Afghanistan, that wonderful place that's been so governable for the last 2,000 years, we're going to, or 4,000, we're going to make it into a modern state, as Robin Rafel said at the National Defense University a couple of years ago. We created a government in Afghanistan the Afghanis can't afford. I mean, how stupid is that? So, got to keep your goals focused. And I think in Iraq, I don't know what our goals were, but whatever they were, we couldn't figure them out, and they kept changing all the time. They went from self-defense to WMD to democracy building to, I don't know what, let's get the hell out of Dodge. What are the goals of your opponents? What are the ideologies of your opponents? This goes to context. Who's supporting them? You can't fight something if you don't understand it. And you can't deal with a problem and resolve a problem or change the circumstances in which the problem arose so it goes away, as Jean Monnet, who said, you never solve problems, you just change the circumstances. If you don't understand what you're trying to deal with, then you can't possibly be successful. And third, what are the means available? I mean, I remember prior to 9/11, or the right after 9/11, no, I guess it was just before, talking about reorganizing the U.S. intelligence community, and Jamie Gorelick, who had been General Counsel of the Department of Defense and then Deputy Attorney General of the Justice Department. And when she went from defense to justice, she took some military aides, because there are a number of American institutions that are really good at seduction, and one of them is the Department of Defense. And she was seduced and believed that the Department of Defense was the one all-purpose institution in the U.S. government. And that's just sick. As we heard, the Department of Defense, above all, blows things up and kills people. That's what its job is. It is not there to build roads, build countries, et cetera. It may be part of that, but that isn't its job. People don't go into the American military to escort kids to high school, to build schools, to become academics. Or as Bob Kagan once said, you don't ask the fist to think, it's a fist. But we've gotten into the habit of dumping all responsibilities for everything on the Department of Defense. It's one of the reasons it's so big. That's an aside. I have lots of asides. For example, without the position of the Arab League, there would have been no Libya campaign. That's important to remember. The Arab League has sat on the sidelines on Syria. So as we think ahead, we need to remember the old sign that used to be ubiquitous in the 1950s. I think it was a plan ahead sign in which the D was too small. There wasn't enough space on the sign, so all the letters were the same size except the D was very small to squeeze in. I don't know what happened to those signs, but they need to be brought out of mothballs. We need to take very seriously the point that Heidi made, that state building and nation building are different. That means words really matter, and that if you call somebody a terrorist or a genocidaire, you're boxing yourself in, maybe. And you have to be very careful about categories. And finally, one needs to remember this is a multidimensional exercise, and therefore just using the military instrument or the diplomatic instrument or the social service instrument is not enough. They have to be coordinated, they have to be calibrated properly. all with a view to achieving your goals, and that context determines whether it's worth it to you. Because these things cost. They cost money, they cost time, they cost lives, and it has to be, in my view, if the U.S. military is going to be involved, it has to be in the vital national interest of the United States, and then the staying power does not become an issue. And that's why I come back to 9/11. It changed the way the president perceives risk. The president cares about ISIS because of, is this going to turn into a new version of Al-Qaeda? Are we going to see attacks on the United States itself if we don't do anything? It's not just the horrors of ISIS. And we're not going to solve ISIS with purely counterinsurgency operations. Because guess what? It's self-financing. It has oil fields. It's selling oil. That's how it's financing its operations and other people's. So again, a multi-dimensional approach is necessary. Finally, let me close with just an observation about transitions. We don't do enough with multinational governance, although there are good examples in Africa. And we have to recall that the transition, the world has a lot of experience now with transitions in countries from violence to stability and what is called transitional justice. But you have to get there, and we're not there in Syria, we're not there in Iraq now, and remains to be seen if we'll ever get there. Anyway, thank you very much, and I think we should have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Making new and provocative points this late in the game is always a great achievement. I want to especially pick up on the point that you made about the rationale for going into Afghanistan and Iraq. It wasn't for humanitarian reasons. I want to remind people of the 2002 National Security Strategy, where one phrase that comes to mind is that America is threatened today more by failing states than by conquering one. The need to put Humpty Dumpty together again is not because of the humanitarian issues, at least viewed from a security point of view, but if it's because unless you have a reasonably functioning governed area, you're setting up the conditions for out-of-area attacks. And I just want to caution that the fact that we haven't seen another sort of 9/11, thankfully, we haven't seen another kind of 9/11 attack the last 13 years, does not necessarily mean that, when we meet here this time next year or in 2 years' time, we may see this entirely differently. I remember having a conversation about this with Stephen Krasner, who was the head of policy planning at the State Department at the time. And he said, look, 9/11 was a shock to the international system, but it wasn't a strong enough shock to really throw out all the rules of the games on sovereignty. If, heaven forbid, it wasn't 3,000 people who were killed on 9/11, but 30,000 or worse, we would have seen a much deeper shock to the system. And perhaps, when we talk about costs, etc., we may well find ourselves, and let's hope that we don't, in a situation where we are willing to make sacrifices and commitment, and where the rationale of counterinsurgency reasserts itself, simply because we identify a threat that is so severe to us that we have to pay the costs once again of large foot presence, etc. Again, let's hope we don't get there, but let's not forget the original rationale for this, which was very fresh in the aftermath of 2011. I want to open this up, but I want to just in a couple of words identify some of the key themes that we've identified here. Can we do this? Should we do this? Right? Should we ever engage in large-scale expeditionary forces, state-building exercises again? If so, when? In what context, right? Small countries, large countries, countries with a homogeneous population versus those who are not, etc. Who is we? I think that one of the most interesting aspects, perhaps of the Obama. This is not new, but is it realistic to expect sort of greater international burden sharing when it comes to this type of thing, or is that really just kind of pie in the sky? Will it always be the United States and maybe the Brits helping out a little bit, maybe the Canadians, the Israelis always out of the picture, at least on the surface? Who is we in this going forward in this context? The issue of costs and constraints, economic constraints, political constraints, legal constraints, I thought was a theme that came up, and then also the question of institutions. I have a friend and a colleague, Michael McFall, who recently completed a tenure as U.S. ambassador to Russia. He always likes to say the United States has got a fantastic institution for regime destruction. It's called the Pentagon. It doesn't have comparable institutions for regime construction. And there are those who would say that it's not that coin has failed and state building has failed, it's that we haven't ever really tried. Okay, I'm throwing this out deliberately as a provocative statement. And I also want to go back to my original question. If we don't do this, and we want to stay safe, given what we know about what's going on in the region, if we don't do this, then what do we do? And perhaps people can comment about that as well, because I haven't heard an answer. And now, look, let me just tell you something about the time frame. Okay, we're scheduled to finish at 11:30, but we have a half-hour break, so we can spill over a little bit if we need to, if there's still appetite. Then there's going to be a lecture by Peter Bergen and a screening of a documentary movie about the capture of Osama bin Laden. Lunch will be a little bit late today. Will be at 2 p.m. So that's where we are in terms of the logistics and the day. If you can identify yourself and address your question to a member of the panel or to everybody. Yes, sir, and then madam. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Paris with the ICSR in London, but for the last 12 years I've been working for this great destroyer, the Pentagon, with the Office of Net Assessment, and I do anything but destroy. It's all about long-term analysis, economic, demographic, political. It's nothing to do with military policy. So I think the DoD has more than just the destructive element. But my question is to Dr. Rostow. Perhaps Professor Hoyt wants to chime in. When you talk about clear goals, I can't agree with you more, but America seems to have a problem with having more than one goal. And we're coming into this situation right now. My problem with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were not just in the lack of clear goals, it was the wrong strategic enemy. The real strategic enemy should have been either maintain the balance of power or hit Iran, or the Iran axis. So now here we're replaying this. We're about to gear up for the goal of destroying, or what does he say, mitigating,
Degrading and destroying.
ISIS.
Yeah.
While we're having this kind of negotiation with our friends in Tehran. But come Thanksgiving, if that doesn't happen, we're going to have another goal to go with it. And I don't think we're able to do that because of the need for clarity, because public opinion is aroused by the beheadings. The Iranian issue will just slip right by us. Any comments?
Well, first of all, I was reminded of a comment from my boss about the origins of the, what was it, take, hold, build strategy that Connie Rice articulated. Apparently, she picked it up when she went to Iraq and met with then Colonel H.R. McMaster, now Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, and asked him what he was doing. And he said, well, I'm taking, holding, and building. She said, That's it. That's what we're doing. Jonathan, your point is perfect. I mean, that's the U.S. government has the hardest time thinking. People in the White House are too busy putting out fires. They have no time to think. Pentagon has no thinking capability at all. The Office of Net Assessment thinks 20 years down the road. Where I work is supposed to be the brain of the Pentagon, but it's been annihilated in the last 3 years. Your point is spot on. I mean, what is the real strategic objective, and how do we go about achieving it? And ISIS is the sort of flavor of the month or the week, while Mr. Putin pushes on an open door. Tehran lurks in the background. And I don't think we know what to do, so we stumble along from day to day.
Tim, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I would actually say that there actually is a little bit more thinking capability in the Pentagon than Dr. Rostow alludes. But again, there is a problem. This last year has been an extraordinarily fluid time in the international system. Remarkably fluid in that the range of emerging crises and emerging threats since last Labor Day, around the time when we last met here, has just been enormous, right? You've had the establishment in Syria of a new so-called Islamic State. You have had Boko Haram, which is actually a serious issue in Africa, which is a place that the United States doesn't pay enough attention to. So it's weird that that's focused our attention, but it's an important international crisis. You've had Ukraine and the rise of Russia after a period of 5 years of relative sloth. And also, frankly, from the United States perspective, probably the most important events that are happening in the world right now are Chinese threats to the territorial sovereignty of our allies in the Pacific Rim. The United States has a lot of different interests in a lot of different places, and prioritizing them is really hard. Iran is one of them, but as we see even in the current debate over ISIS, are we more concerned about isolating Iran or about using Iran to resolve the ISIS crisis? These are serious debates. They go on in Israel in a different way because Israel's interests are different. But I don't think you would find a lot of support for the idea that the predominant crisis, the predominant national interest of the United States is Iran. And I hate to say that in front of an Israeli audience, but it's just a fact. Iran is a very significant problem and a very significant threat from the United States perspective. But we have somehow managed North Korea, which is an even crazier state that actually has nuclear weapons. And Iran, there are some who would be comfortable with doing that. I think what you see here is an interplay of priorities and interests. And this has been a really hard year for that. That doesn't solve problems, but it's important to realize that they're not easy either, even within the region. The relationship that we have with Iran and how it plays with Syria and how it plays with the nuclear question, those are really complicated, and a lot of different people are working on them from a lot of different perspectives.
I just want to say a quick word in response. What you just said about Iran's place in the American hierarchy of interests may be correct, but when the President of the United States and his Secretary of Defense state, in confirmation hearing, says containment is not the issue. We are not going to permit Iran to obtain a nuclear bomb, period, without qualification. Then the entire credibility of the administration is put on the line, just as it was in various other situations. And that's a big, big problem for this administration.
Okay, yes, please just identify yourself. Sir, I saw you, and then Ari, yeah.
My name is Paulina Bilekova. I'm an MA student here at LTC. I'm doing my master's thesis on Israeli strategies of prevention of Palestinian Muslim
understand what you mean exactly. Do you mean like providing the population some resources? In the case of Gaza, fighting while providing electricity and allowing. Okay, so what is the question regarding?
What is the strategic value of simultaneous application of both strategies, actually?
Okay, so what are you suggesting is that we have some kind of schizophrenic approach to this matter. That on the one side we kill them, and on the other side we feed them, or something like that. Yes, you're right, and many in Israeli public they have some their own questions regarding that, but it has to do with the entire paradoxical, complicated logic of this region, and obviously there is. Are we in trouble?
No, I think we're. I think we're good. Yeah. When we start smelling smoke, then we'll know.
Someone didn't like what I said.
Yeah.
Okay, I think there is. First of all, there is an effort to try and differentiate between the Hamas that is ruling Gaza and the fight against the Hamas and the Palestinian population in general. Obviously, this attempt is very, very problematic from different reasons. I think it, as I said, it's this whole aspect is problematic. But Israel has some obligations towards the humanitarian situation in Gaza during the fighting. So I don't see a situation where Israel doesn't provide this, this assistance to the population.
I just would like to clarify the point. I used the word strategic, not just competitive, but because actually my question was about whether Israeli government and security community use, for example, supply of resources as a strategic leverage and not just an obligation for the people.
So using it as strategic leverage in terms of like winning hearts and minds. And look, it's very frustrating. I'll tell you that during the 2004, the last operation, there were mortars that were fired on the Erez crossing, hitting taxi drivers and ambulances, driving Palestinians to Israeli hospitals to get regular treatment, not even injuries from the operation, but people who did the crossing who had permits to get treatments in Israeli hospitals. And one of those taxi drivers got killed by in the Erez crossing during the. So this is very frustrating situation. But I think that until I would say maybe 1945, any military commander who would face a situation like in Gaza would do a simple thing: would put Gaza under siege, complete siege, not blockade, siege. And because this is a small area, it is easily contained, and you don't have to invade Gaza. You can just put it under siege, and the Gaza population and its leadership would surrender after a month of starvation. And you read many instances like that in history. This is not possible any longer. There is an international commitment, there is a humanitarian commitment, there is a moral commitment. So I think this is not under any debate. But your question whether this would allow any strategic leverage, I think the expectations from the Israeli side is very low.
I think, Paulina, there's a lot to say about that, and if you want, we can follow up on that. But sir, yes, please.
My name is Dave Brown. I have both a practical and academic interest in the subject. Full disclosure, I'm a retired Army colonel. I just retired after 30 years in the Army, U.S. Army. But I'm a professor of Naval Warcraft, so full disclosure, I fought with Lieutenant Colonel in the USA. So whatever I say that's bad is what it comes back. A couple of comments real quick. One is, So if you're talking about a particular insurgency, it depends what happens after that insurgency on a couple of big issues. A couple of them have been mentioned. One of them, I believe, has not. It depends partly on how the coin was conducted in the first place and what kind of repercussions flow out of that. Okay. It depends in large measure what kind of external support. I think that Dr. Rostov mentioned that a little bit. The amount of external support to that insurgency and whether or not that is ongoing afterwards or not has a huge amount to do with it. But one thing that wasn't really mentioned is really the expertise or the ability of your local partner.
Mhm.
So I mean, there are other insurgencies that we haven't really mentioned in terms of successful insurgencies. South Korea is a good example. There was an insurgency in 48-50 in South Korea. The civilian government crushed it. Okay, and partly the outcome of that insurgency was the viability of the South Korean state and the strength of the leaders that are working in that regard. Although Colonel Kenkel mentioned the Philippines, and you can go back to earlier segments of the Philippines, look at the Hut Rebellion, and look at the fact that Amichai did a lot of things. The government was an operational partner that was well able to handle those issues. So the strength of the local partner is a big deal. But I think the big issue is it depends on external support, depends on the local government. When you are shackled to a corpse, okay, as the comments about World War I, if you're shackled to the regime in Afghanistan,
Mm.
or you're shackled to an incompetent global actor, the outcomes are going to be very different. And the other thing is that we didn't really mention this, and I think that there is a question, an academic question, about what is the future of coin as a doctrine.
Mhm.
And I think, at least in the United States, that's up for debate because the coin, population-centered coin that was at the heart of that British 24 was oversold.
Mhm.
And I think that there is an active debate in military circles in the Department of Defense right now as to whether or not the viability of it as a complete package and its sufficiency as an operational context is as viable as a lot of people put forth in the tradition.
Thank you for those comments. I wish we would have had you on the panel. We'll do that hopefully next year. Ari, and then we'll conclude. We'll continue over coffee.
So my question comes from a quote that I heard at one place in the Daily Show from former Pakistani ambassador to the United States, where he said that America doesn't lose wars, it loses interest. And so then my question speaks to that if we can develop a solid coin strategy, there can be a lot of scholarship on it, but what can we do about the fact that we've only become reliable to our enemies that we will leave before we're done, and unreliable to our allies because of political upheaval that the United States is subject to. Or also in Israel, where we saw in the last operation, it started off very strong, and as the casualties mounted up and the cost of the reserves got too high, people started getting more anxious to leave whether we were done or not.
Yeah. So this goes to this issue of costs and constraints, right? Political constraints, also the thesis of the internal pacification of liberal democratic societies, our decreasing willingness to sacrifice, to be killed, and to kill others, perhaps. So anybody wants to take a stab on that? John?
I don't think the U.S. ever loses interest when we've identified a conflict that's truly in the national interest. I think that's what you were going to earlier. Every time we've lost interest, it's not been an existential threat to the U.S. So I think that's an imperative when you're trying to use national force, is if it's not in the vital national interest, you've got to know that at the end there is some time horizon you have to plan for, either resource-based or public capacity-based.
Tim, last word?
Yeah, Hussein Haqqani is a friend of mine. And he's a very glib guy, and he has a quick turn of phrase, and that was one of his good ones. I think this idea of how important a conflict is in American national interest is really critical to understanding what the United States is likely to commit and how. And I would argue, and I'll be a little controversial, the part of the problem that we've gotten into in this century is that we have made extremely large commitments for interests that were relatively moderate. Now, that's not to say that Afghanistan was not a serious interest. It's not to say that removing Saddam Hussein from power was not a serious interest. But let us be honest, these are not World War II. This is not the American Civil War. Making an enormous, open-ended, long-term commitment of American troops in occupation and the establishment of a modern democratic state, either in the Persian Gulf or in the highlands of the Hindu Kush, those are pretty optimistic objectives. And quite frankly, I think we set our aims way too high. Dr. Rostow talked earlier about what happened in Afghanistan. My own theory is we went into Afghanistan not planning on changing the state. We went into Afghanistan planning on overthrowing the state, trying to catch Osama bin Laden, setting up some kind of international community intervention to try and make it a better state, and then we would leave. However, I think what you saw was bleed over from the rhetoric of Iraq. The rhetoric of Iraq before we began Operation Iraqi Freedom was, we are going to take Iraq, which is a secular society, and we're going to make it into a democracy. And from that democracy, which will be our friend and our ally, we will transform the Middle East, and there will never be a terrorist threat to America again. That's extraordinarily ambitious and maybe unrealistic. But I think at the same time, you begin to see that bleeding over to Afghanistan, where we also feel the same commitment to rebuild Afghanistan, which is a totally different project. It's a totally different culture. American prestige was attached to these. And I think we're paying a price for that now. In point of fact, these were more modest objectives for us and maybe did not merit the enormous expenditure of resources that we put to those projects. And the key learning might be in the future, let's be as pragmatic about identifying what our interests are as possible so that we do not emphasize the resources that we're willing to spend for something that is modest. That might lower expectations in the international community, and it might lower the sense that the United States is willing to bail on allies. But that's really hard to do. It sounds really simple. It's hard in practice. Clausewitz talks about it a lot in On War, right? That the most important thing you need to do is to understand the nature of war you're going into and what you're willing to pay in order to accomplish it. It is fundamentally problematic. At the same time, we could have achieved and may still achieve a great deal in Afghanistan and Iraq. We may simply find that we've paid much more for it than we had to, and that's unfortunate.
Eitan?
Just
Last word.
Professor Rostow spoke about the importance of external state sponsorship or state sponsor. I think we in the West, and speaking about the West in general, we did a very poor job in terms of confronting state sponsor for different types of terrorism and insurgencies. And the list is long. We can talk about Pakistan and Taliban. We can talk about Turkey and its role of supporting ISIS, at least initially, Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda and ISIS as well. Of course, now they are in different situation. But I think this also suggests something about our, sorting out our priorities, sorting out our interests, because we all know that there are some contrasting interests in terms of confronting these countries about these issues.
As you can see, we could easily conduct a whole day on these questions. I want to thank the Ragunis family for being with us today. Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you. And now we have the coffee break and the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you very much. Danny, don't forget. And of course, I want to thank Danny for putting all of this together. I'm sorry, I should have said that at the beginning.